I'm an advocate for SDG 7, which promotes energy access for all, that everybody should have access to energy. My name is Olajumoke Delano, and welcome to another episode of Energy Explained. Today, we'll be talking about the journey to developing an efficient state electricity market. What does that really entail? I believe in that too. And one of the routes that we need to take to get to that destination in Nigeria is through the development of strong, efficient state electricity markets. Now, what does that require, you may say? In previous episodes, I had talked about the process, for developing a state electricity market under the Electricity Act of 2023. Very interesting process. And as is expected within a law never goes into so much detail. The law gives you an overall framework, a broad view of, what you're expected to do. And then there are still things that little details that come up in other forms. And so today we're going to be talking about what is required for designing an efficient state electricity market. I had talked in previous episodes also about a policy, the need for a policy. So, a policy is that vision statement that the government issues, that the state government issues, that this is where we're going and this is how we're going to get there. These are the commitments we're making, these are the incentives we're providing in order to hasten the process of getting to a state electricity market, an efficient one. Because you don't just want to build a state electricity market, you want to build an electricity market that is very efficient. So you need a policy. A policy also shows that the state government is committed, because it is the commitment of the state government in writing, for the development of that state electricity market. So a policy is one of the stops in the journey. It looks like a drive-through. So you are driving and your destination is, I want to develop as a state, I want to develop an efficient state electricity market. What are the things I need to do? And we've mentioned the first. The first stop is policy. Now, I'll mention something important. Sometimes the law developing the state electricity market comes out before the policy. In fact, in Nigeria, I will have you know that at the national level, the Electricity Act came out before the national electricity policy. And so the fact that ideally you should have your policy which shows the vision of the government, how the government is going to arrive at the state electricity market. And the next stop is your law, your state electricity law. So the state electricity law should now commit into provisions of the law, firm provisions of the law, what the policy has said. The electricity law that the state must create must also have, details about the creation of the Electricity Commission, any other state agencies that are relevant for reaching this destination of creating, an efficient market. So you have the policy developed by the Ministry of Energy or Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. There are different names that this ministry are called. You have that policy. Then you have the law. And the law must be robust enough, not just to set up a state electricity commission, regulatory commission, but also to develop the market. So things like tariffs, things like licensing, like consumer protection, it must be a rich and robust law. Please refer to my previous episode when I talked about what should be in your state electricity law. So we've talked about policy and we've talked about law. The other thing that is an important stop along the journey is what kind of market structure. What kind of market structure exists? At the national level in Nigeria, the national structure that exists is that you have the national regulator, you have different generation companies in different parts of the country, you have one transmission company of Nigeria, one independent systems operator, and then about 12 distribution companies. So that in itself is a structure. On the government side, you have the Ministry of Power, you have the National Electricity Regulatory Commission, you have the bulk buyer, MBET, you have different players, taking up different roles. You have NAPTIN, that's the Training Institute. You have NEMSA, the Electricity Management Service Institute. So those are the players at the national level. But as you develop your market at the state level, who are the players? Of course, you need to have generators, those that will produce the energy that the citizens enjoy. Then you need to have transmission. Who is going to transmit that energy? And then you have, of course, distribution companies, those that will wheel the energy from the transmission company to the end users like you and me. Then what about the retailers? Retailers are those that buy and sell energy, not at the level of the bulk trader. Their role is to buy energy and from the generation companies and sell even to the end users. So you have trader or retailers. And then, of course, you and me, the operators also exist in the market. So you need to have a market structure that you think about as a state in your mind. Who are the key players and how do I need to ensure that there is an efficient there's synergy between each of the players in this market, and also to ensure that there's no confusion, there's no overlap of functions in the roles that these people play. So that is what you call the market structure. Another stop is licensing. What kind of licenses will you issue? For a generation company, of course, you would issue a generation license. What quantity of and what capacity are you going to issue? Are you going to have different thresholds for different capacities? What are the terms and the conditions of the licenses that you are going to give to each of the operators, to give to the generation companies that are coming into the state to take advantage of the natural resources that the state has in order to generate energy for the benefit of the state citizens or even people outside the state. So you need to have licensing procedures. These licensing procedures are usually provided for within the law, but they are a very important part of developing a state electricity market because potential investors will be coming to request for those licensing terms and conditions to see what is contained in them, to see whether the terms of licensing are favorable to an incoming operator, whether a distribution company, whether a retail company, whether a generation company or a trader. Those are key points that investors will be looking at. Tariff methodology. This is another key stop, on the journey to developing a state electricity market. Tariffs are so important because the tariffs, that's the price that end users pay for energy. Whether these end users are large power users, industrial companies, whether they are individuals, whether they are small, medium scale enterprises, the tariff is what they pay. And it's that tariff that the investor plugs into the model, the tariff model, to know whether and how long it will take for them to recover the investment that they've put in. So those are the key areas. Moving on from the tariff methodology, grid access rules. So every state in Nigeria now receives electricity from the grid. The energy being generated and being transmitted and distributed is definitely not enough for the demand that exists. However, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. The recommendation will be that the states optimize the energy they can get from the grid and then build up from there. One of the things that is so important is that for states that will be coming in to begin generation, even in the states, how will they access the grid? For example, if they have more energy than the state requires. So there needs to be a synergy between the state rules and the national rules. So that's very important. So there should be non-discriminatory access, to existing and, prospective generators in order to ensure that there is efficiency along the value chain of generation, transmission, and distribution and sale of electricity. When you have a market with a lot of players, as we've mentioned now, there must be a coordinator. And the coordinator, the agency that plays the coordinating role is the State Electricity Regulatory Commission. The State Electricity Regulatory Commission issues license terms and conditions that tells each operator what they're supposed to do. Each player in the market, they get, these license terms and conditions stating their roles and their responsibilities. And so they must comply with those rules. And if they don't, then the state electricity regulator can write to them and notify them that they are in breach. And usually the electricity law of a state will have given significant powers, for the state electricity regulatory commission to be able to discharge its responsibilities of ensuring compliance with the terms and conditions of the licenses of each of these operators, and also ensuring that compliance with the state electricity law, regulations that are issued, orders that are issued, those documents and instruments that are issued by the commission is not issuing them advisedly. They are meant, the contents must be obeyed by the operator. So another key step is ensuring that the regulator is able to effectively monitor, the operators in the market. Another key point for consideration as you move towards developing an efficient state electricity market is, what about renewable energy? It's so important. Renewable energy is extremely important, because of the effects of greenhouse gases, emissions on the planet. So it is important that, what are the renewable energy resources within the state, and how can this be optimized in order to plug the energy deficit in the state? It's very important that a lot of consideration is given to this. Another reason why a state will want to consider renewable energy is because of global warming we've mentioned. But what about the opportunities and the funding that is available for renewable energy projects? A state will be interested in getting access to the opportunities available for funding renewable energy projects in the states through mini grids and even bigger projects that are bigger than mini grids. Why not? A state should consider and incorporate this into its framework. Quality of service is also key. The quality of service that the end users receive. So it's not just about the investors who want to get a good return, or the operators. It's also about the end users, the consumers who are receiving energy. There are industrial customers, for example, that went off the grid, when it was a centralized market, because the voltage, the fluctuations, the unreliability had ruined, their equipment. And, the kind of their production lines could not accommodate those types of fluctuations, could not accommodate the unreliability. And they decided, to move their sensitive equipment off the grid. So the quality of service is essential, that even whilst making the market attractive for investors to come in, it is also important that these investors, when they come in, must deliver, in accordance with the codes, the standard codes, within the state, the national codes. There must be compliance, and the service that is being provided, must be safe. That's another angle, must be safe. Electricity is a wonderful product, but it's a very dangerous one if not properly, used and deployed. So the quality of service for end users and the safety of end users must be taken into consideration. The last point I'll mention now is on capacity building. That cannot be overemphasized. Electricity is a very technical field, and it is important that states build capacity of their staff, of their leadership, of the directors in the different agencies that have to do with energy. And I'll mention a few. The Ministry of Power, of course, the Ministry of Water Resources, where there's a hydro dam, the Ministry of Justice for the enforcement of where there are electricity offenses, how are these electricity offenders going to be brought to book? So the Ministry of Justice is there. One of the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance usually plays a key role also where there's going to be any form of intervention by the government. The Ministry of Finance plays a role. What about the Ministry of Environment? So all these agencies of government, they play a key role. And apart from educating the members of the staff of State Electricity Regulatory Commission, the Ministry of Energy, these other agencies are important in designing an efficient state electricity market. So this is just a summary. I've mentioned policy, enabling law, market structure, licensing procedures, the tariff methodology, the grid access rules, active monitoring by the regulator, renewable energy, quality of service monitoring, and capacity building. These are just a few stops along the way to developing an efficient state electricity market. Until I come your way again, my name is Olajumoke. See you on the next episode of Energy Explained.